we do not have complete control of our perceptions. Before actually anything reaches consciousness, a huge amount of data compression goes on to make apparent sense of it. One of the things I've noticed, which I want to name the Sutherland effect, is that when you have your car valeted, even though all they've done is clean the interior, when you drive away, it feels as if it's a better car and drives better. I don't know how many other people have noticed that. When you come out of a car wash, it doesn't just make your car seem cleaner, it actually affects the way it seems to drive. And we seem to have a huge amount of data compression going on, which is important to understand. So even perception itself isn't very accurate. Now, Hayek, interestingly, who I quoted earlier, is an Austrian economist. The great thing the Austrians understood is that value is entirely subjective. Ludwig von Mises said, there is no useful distinction to be made between the value you create in a restaurant by cooking the food and the value you create by sweeping the floor. That the context in which something is consumed will affect the overall value indistinguishably, I think, as this demonstrates, in many cases, from what the actual food is. One of the worst things you can do, by the way, is if you've got a restaurant, which is perceptually awful, but where the product's good, one of the daftest, imagine a place which smells of sewage, and you're serving Michelin-starred food, what a lot of people will try and do is make the food even better. And it's a terrible, terrible business mistake. The Royal Mail did it in the UK. They tried to make a 98% next-day delivery of first-class mail 99. What they failed to realize was that the consumer perception of the reliability of the first-class post was about 50 to 70%. So why on earth change the reality when the perception is already worse than the reality? The value of a stamp, as von Mises would said, it does not rest in the probability that the letter will arrive next day. My readiness to pay for a stamp arises from my belief that the letter will arrive the next day. All you needed to do was advertise the fact that it was 98%, or even better, choose a heuristic, which I'll come to later, which is telling people that the British Post Office was better than the German Post Office. That's a heuristic all Brits use. If we do anything better than the Germans, it's good enough, by the way. And you could create far, far more value, because perceived value is not distinct from actual value. All value is perceived value. And the greatest model of the brain which starts to understand some of this change is one that Jonathan Haidt says. It's the system 1 brain is the greater part. It can process about 54 megabits a second. The system 2 brain, our rational consciousness, can only process about 50 bits a second. So a spectacular amount of editing and data compression goes on in system 1 before we even become consciously aware of something. The idea that we're actually impartial observers of data in the world is fundamentally wrong. The other point Haidt makes is that system 2 is like a man riding on an elephant. He thinks he's in control. He thinks he's powerful. System 2, the man on the elephant, does have slightly longer time horizons than the elephant, slightly better capacity for deferred gratification. But in decision-making and behavioral change, there's one vital point to be made here. If the elephant doesn't want to go somewhere, there's nothing the man can do about it. That ultimately, the other thing about system 2, the man on the elephant, is he's delusional. Because consciousness resides in system 2 and therefore dominates our awareness of ourselves, Kahneman puts it beautifully. He says, the system 2 brain, our consciousness, thinks it's the Oval Office of our decision-making, when in reality it's the press office. That actually most of the time it's issuing hurriedly constructed narratives as a post-rationalization of decisions already taken by the elephant. It thinks it's a Barack Obama. Really what it's doing is it's a kind of Alistair Campbell. And in many cases, our attitudes, actually, attitudinal change follows behavioral change. Of course, system 2 doesn't admit to this because it's just too awful a confession to actually admit that the elephant decides where I'm going. Nonetheless, it's true. Paul Dolan, a professor at the LSE, and I came up with this slightly weird phrase, which is when a man says, my wife doesn't understand me, it doesn't mean he's planning an affair, it means he's already had one. Okay? The way that we think we should make decisions is the kind of McKinsey model of having an affair. It's, well, I've noticed declining levels of empathy on my wife's balanced scorecard, and over the last quarter, they've dropped below an acceptable level, so it's time to outsource a range of sexual services to competing providers. That's kind of the McKinsey model of how you should have relationships. What happens in reality is a bloke gets drunk at a party, ends up snogging someone he doesn't even like very much, and in a desperate attempt to make sense of his actions, he constructs an entirely bogus case against his wife. So the vital understanding here is we need to learn to talk to the elephant, but we're spending most of our time talking to the rider, who, as I said, has some virtuous qualities, but is delusional. The elephant doesn't use rational mathematical models of decision-making. What it uses is heuristics. This is how you catch a ball. No great cricketer or great baseball player is a fantastic theoretical physicist or mathematician. They do not get a scientific calculator out and solve quadratic equations. They use a heuristic or rule of thumb. In the case of catching a ball, it is you look up at the ball, you calculate the angle of gaze, and you move towards the ball at whatever speed keeps that angle of gaze constant. It's slightly suboptimal because it causes you to move in a slight arc, whereas a perfect solution would have you moving in a straight line. But basically, as a rule of thumb, he doesn't have to consider any data points. He doesn't have to consider the velocity at which the ball left the bat. He doesn't have to consider wind resistance, anything of this kind. He just has to follow that heuristic. That's how Chesley Sullenberger landed that plane on the Hudson. He knew he couldn't land at Teterboro, if you listen to the cockpit voice recording, within 1.5 seconds. How did he know that? He's a glider pilot. He looks out of the window, puts the plane into the lowest angle of descent possible, and all those things on the horizon that are moving up in his field of vision are places where he can't land, and everywhere that's moving down is a place where he can. The only place he could see where he could land was the river. He made that decision in 1.5 seconds. He didn't look at the instruments. Dogs use exactly the same heuristic as this to catch frisbees, so there's some evidence it might be innate or it might simply be learned. What's interesting is that no cricketer knows this is how they do it. And this is a vital thing, that a huge portion of our decision-making and our actions are actually beneath and beyond the level of conscious awareness. Now, if you want to change behavior, programming people heuristically, we're in danger of writing software for the wrong operating system, forever trying to use rational persuasion to talk to System 2, when System 2 isn't really in command, it just thinks it is. Frederick the Great wanted Prussians to eat potatoes, because if you have 2 sources of carbohydrate, there's much less price volatility in food, there's less risk of famine, because people can substitute. What he then did was he tried legislation. And it failed. There were people imprisoned for refusing to grow potatoes. He tried rational argument. People refused again. They said they look disgusting. We can't even get a dog to eat the things. Why should we eat them ourselves? So he tried talking to System 1 instead. He tried talking to the elephant. And he used a very, very powerful heuristic called basically scarcity bias. He declared the potato was a royal vegetable and only members of the royal family could eat it. And he planted a royal potato patch outside the palace, which was guarded night and day, but with secret instructions to the guards not to guard it very well. Pretty quickly, people told, this food's too good for you, only emperors can have it, were pretty quickly nicking the stuff and planting it themselves. That's what happens when you talk to the elephant. One of the things we had was an interesting brief with DrinkAware, where we were arguing against the idea of recommending alcohol consumption at a per unit level per week, 28 units a week for men, 21 for women. We said it is rational, but it is not intelligent. Now, this is a vital distinction. In business thinking, rationality has become conflated with intelligence. No one ever gets fired for being irrational. In fact, what most people are looking for is not the best decision. They're looking for the most rationally sound decision, so it's a decision they can't get fired for making. Rationality is often used as a kind of crutch and defense mechanism. Now, let me explain this. No scientist will ever get fired. You do the epidemiological studies, you look at 28 units a week, people below that level, men below that level seem not to actually suffer any ill health effects, so therefore we'll make that the recommendation. Except that it's terrible. It requires constant cognitive self-restraint, constant mental effort. It doesn't become socially self-reinforcing. It's very easy to practice self-delusion. You convince yourself that that 14.9% litre bucket of Chilean Merlot is a single glass of wine, when it's actually about 4 units, and it doesn't become ritualized or habituated. We said the best thing to do is actually don't drink 3 days a week. Now, that's not a rational piece of advice. You could theoretically follow that advice and still be a raging alcoholic on the other 4 days. However, it's socially norming. Groups of people can all agree. Your girlfriend, wife, husband, or whatever can police you. Don't forget, if you drink tonight, you can't drink tomorrow. Binary decisions are easy for System 1 to make. I do that, I don't do that. Quantitative decisions require cognitive effort. You wouldn't really, unless your girlfriend worked for the Stasi, you wouldn't really accept her going, you have had 3.4 units today, therefore tomorrow you will have to reduce your... It's not really acceptable, okay? And we suddenly realized, where do we go for a precedent to justify what we believe to be true? And we realized it was God. When God wanted to institute a working time directive, he didn't do what the French did and say 35 hours a week. He said, on the 7th day you rest. It's a Sabbath. It's socially self-reinforcing. It's easy to police. It's very easy to spot Sabbath breaking. It's not easy to spot Frenchmen who've already worked 35 hours that week. They can just say, I got up late, and they're off the hook. It's also habitual and ritualized, and System 1 loves habit and ritual. Now, what we suddenly realize is that rationality does not lead to optimal solutions. If you try and be rational, there may be cases where actually what you legislate for is socially hopeless. There's a brilliant example Paul Feldwick told me of an Indian tribe in the southwest of the United States whose hunting methodology was as follows. They put a big bison bone on a fire, and the shaman waited for it to crack and told them to set out hunting in the direction of the line of the crack. Completely arbitrary and ridiculous in rational scientific terms. They were also the most successful tribe at hunting in the entire region. Why? Quite simply, because there was no dissent within the group. The shaman told them to head up in that direction, and they all stuck together. You didn't get people going, but I told you we should have gone to the waterfall, and I wanted to go fishing, and I didn't even want to go hunting at all. There was complete unanimity in the group, and they never split up. So what was apparently individualistically irrational was socially incredibly useful. And the best laws are heuristic laws, not rational laws. Now, the other thing we need to understand is that there are ways of solving problems which psychological insight gives us, which I think are tremendous. This is a traffic light they've pioneered in South Korea, where the red light counts down. Psychologically, the nature of a weight is not determined by its duration, a mathematical function, but by the degree of uncertainty you experience in the weight. The single best thing the London Underground did per pound spent in terms of passenger satisfaction was nothing to do with faster, more frequent, later running, bigger trains with more seats on them. They put dot matrix display boards on the platform, so you knew when your next train was due. The nature of a weight is deeply psychologically affected by system one reactions. And the idea that there's a mathematical function for it may be dangerously wrong. In Minnesota, they have a thing called the zipper merge. They teach people when you have a contraflow and two lanes go down to one, they've taught people a heuristic. It's go all the way to the end where the two lanes go to one and then take it in turns. The more efficient thing would be 10 cars at a time. But 10 cars at a time, the 11th car will always try and cheat, and you get accidents. Take it in turns as a heuristic that System 1 understands absolutely brilliantly. This is my suggestion for getting people to finish their course of antibiotics. Don't give them 26 white pills, give them 20 white pills and 6 blue ones, and tell them when you finish the white pills, take the blue ones. Any course of action which has breadcrumbs in it, which has milestones in it, is easier for System 1 to actually cope with. The loading bar, the software loading bar, is exactly the case. If the loading bar shows signs of moving, you'll happily wait around for 20 minutes to download software. If you click on a link and nothing happens, you give up after about 5 seconds. I won't have time to show this film, but there's some vital implications here for things like dieting. Now, I don't look like the man to advertise this, but you should have seen me a few months ago. One of the reasons Atkins diets work is not because they're actually nutritionally perfect, but because they're behaviorally easy. You can eat this stuff, you can't eat that stuff. System 1 can cope with that sort of thing. If you look at Jewish dietary law and most other religious laws, they're around very intelligent binary stuff. What the Europeans would do, what the European Union would do, would have published an 80,000-word directive on the hygiene of pig farming. Much more sensibly, you know, the original prophets just said, no pigs. Much, much easier to police, much, much easier in System 1. Trying to lose weight through continuous calorie reduction is a bit like trying to give up sex by going to lap dancing bars instead. It's like giving yourself a bit less of what you really want every time. It requires insane self-restraint, and System 2 gets tired. System 1 doesn't get tired. So primal diets, you can shop for them. When you go shopping, you just buy this kind of food. You can't shop for a calorie-restricted diet in the same way. And equally, because it's habitual, it actually becomes slightly self-reinforcing. So if you go on a primal diet for 2 weeks, you will start to look at things like Danish pastries as being slightly disgusting. With a calorie restriction diet, it may be nutritionally optimal, but it fundamentally is psychologically flawed. And where you get appalling problems, because no one is talking about System 1 in boardrooms and in decision-making. And the job of the research company and the advertising agency going forward will partly be as a translation agency to translate System 1 human behavioral thinking into System 2, obsessively System 2 business decision-making. This is why this is so important. When they bid $16 billion for a 3G license, nobody thought, but is there a measure by which we can get people to pay for data by the megabyte? You can't. If you charge by the megabyte, let's say a book is half a megabyte. Let's say a book costs 50p. That means that a music track has to cost £3, and a film has to cost £500 to download. There is no mental frame or mental map in which we can see price ratios for those things in that kind of way. So what they did is they actually made a decision without understanding basically the fundamental psychological problem that underlies charging for data by consumption.